And then when I read that good crystals were extremely rare, there was another challenge. Maybe I can find some good crystals. And eventually I did find some samples with tiny microcrystals. Then it turned out mineral collectors and even mineralogists don't study graphite much. So it was a place I could focus some energy and maybe discover some new things, which turned out to be the case and has been pretty exciting. And then the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2010 for graphene, I felt kind of, yes, this was all worth it after all. Graphite is indeed important and beautiful.
I also love the story of how graphene was discovered, but because Andrew Geim's lab had a tradition of like Friday night fun in the lab, and that's how they discovered graphene, was just try some things that sound crazy, and that one happened to work.
And pretty wonderful. I had a website making beautiful pictures of graphite available, and Andre Geim actually emailed me wondering if he can get some high quality crystals for his work. And that was 5 years before he won the Nobel Prize.
Hey, did you know that as far as I know, Andrew Geim is the only person to have won a Nobel Prize and an Ig Nobel Prize?
Yes. I show in my physics classes sometimes the video they made of the floating frog in a magnetic field.
That's right. That was the Ig Nobel Prize.
Yes. But wonderfully, graphite for a mineral has one of the highest magnetic susceptibilities known. So it also floats pretty nicely.
Yeah, so people will say, they show this video of the frog floating in the magnetic field, and they say it doesn't hurt the frog. But how do they know?
Yeah. I think they have a floating strawberry and a floating cricket.
Well, I mean, with magnetic fields that strong, you can levitate things you wouldn't normally think about.
You do wonder, would it do anything special to any of the differentiating different materials in your body?
Right.
With different susceptibilities.
So there's a question in the chat. What is an Ig Nobel Prize? So the short answer is, if you Google Ig Nobel Prize, you will come up with a yearly ceremony that is held. I think it was originally by the editors of the Annals of Improbable Research, and it's been taken over by NPR's Science Friday. And their tagline is research that first makes you laugh and then makes you think.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's another in the chat. It says it does temporarily hurt the frog. It messes with their inner ear. And they hop in circles for several hours.
It's no fun having your inner ear disturbed.
No. So I see we're coming up on 6 o'clock. For those of you who are tuned in online, we have a very nice attendance today, John. It seems like there are a lot of people interested in the Mineral Museum here, and I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. I will just okay, I see that one's getting an answer. So let's move on to the introductions. Hello, everyone. For those of you who were expecting to see Dr. Callahan, who is the normal host for Husky Bites, she had some travel and asked me to step in for her and host Husky Bites with my colleague in physics, John Jaszczak, and his colleague, Patty Cobin, who I will ask him to introduce here in a moment. But it's really my pleasure to introduce John John is a professor in physics, and more importantly for the discussion at hand, is the director of the A.E. Seaman Mineral Museum, and has an abiding interest in minerals, as you perhaps could tell from our discussion before we started this, and will give us a little bit later a little bit of a walking tour of the museum. And also, we learned in rehearsal that there is so much to cover that there will be another presentation on the Seaman Mineral Museum coming up next year. So stay tuned for that. I will also say that the next Husky Bites broadcast will be Dr. David Flaspohler, who will be coming up. I think that's next Monday. And so please tune in for that one as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Well, thank you very much, Will. It's my pleasure to introduce Patty Cobin. Patty is our museum manager, and she manages me as well as all the other operations at the museum, which I really appreciate. Patty got her master's degree in geology here at Michigan Tech, and she's been with the museum for over 4 years now. Well, we thought we would start our program with a brief PowerPoint presentation, but like Will said, we really want to get to the walking tour and save plenty of time for Q&A later. And I believe we're sharing my screen. I just want to confirm that. Is that right, Will?
Yes, we are seeing your screen.
So the title is 120 Years of the A.E. Seaman Mineral Museum. And this evening, we'd like to give a mix of talking about various people, places, and things. Of course, the things in the Mineral Museum. And in terms of places, though, first, I wanted to highlight that we really live in a very unique place. And that's determined by the geology. So we have a little illustration of that with the geological map here. I'm actually not a geologist, so I'm not going to try and explain all this, but you could see the Keweenaw Peninsula there with a line up the spine where the fault is, because ultimately it's the geology that determined what's so important. It's the formation of the copper deposits here. But the geology determined the waterways, ultimately where the mines were built, where the towns were built, and even things like the shape of the Shaft Rock House, like illustrated there with the very famous Quincy #2 Shaft Rock House with the rainbow in the back. But copper is the hero of the story, and that geology produced a tremendous quantity of native copper, and that was economic to mine. Most copper deposits in the world are ores, but here it was native metal. And we can have a little participation question here. How much copper is estimated to have been mined during 150 years of the modern mining in copper country? And we're going to have a poll come up. Which I don't see, but do you see that? Oh, there it is. Excellent. And Will, you can tell us how long this should run. And while that's going, you can see in the background there, this giant mass of copper hanging in the Amik mine. And the photograph was taken by John T. Reeder. Reeder had a fantastic mineral collection, copper country and worldwide, that is now at the museum.
Okay, another 5 seconds. Get your votes in.
J.T. Reeder was also known for being one of the first photographers of mineral specimens up close.
Okay, so we have a result, John. Do you want me to share, or do you want, well, there you go. Do you see the results, John?
I did, and it looked like D was the most popular, 1.2 billion pounds.
That's right.
The answer is over 12 billion pounds. It's just boggling, isn't it?
That's amazing.
Just from the Calumet and Hecla mines, where the conglomerate ores were mined, it was like the mother lode ore. That itself had over 4 billion pounds of copper refined.
So, John, I heard that there was more money that came out of the Keweenaw in copper than gold in California. Is that correct?
I don't know, actually. Somebody will Google it for us, I'm sure. But we were the first metal mining rush, so that preceded the gold mining rush. So there we go, 12 billion. So kind of as a testimony to the immensity of the copper, sometimes the copper occurred in giant masses in the veins. Those veins extended out into Lake Superior. So here on the museum grounds near the entrance to the parking lot, we have a pavilion with a copper specimen in it that's 19 feet long, estimated to weigh about 34,000 pounds. And it was taken from the bottom of Lake Superior at Great Sand Bay. And so that's a wonderful thing to see. It's currently closed up for the winter, but we'll be looking forward to uncovering it when the snow melts. Well, the mining started in the early 1840s, and the state legislature realized there were more mining engineers needed. So they enacted legislation in 1861 to establish the Michigan Mining School at or near the village of Houghton. The Civil War caused a delay for that, but the legislation was reenacted, and in 1885, the school was indeed started. And I think it's really interesting that that enabling legislation charged the school's trustees or board that they shall provide for obtaining and establishing a complete collection of minerals of the Upper Peninsula and properly classifying the same. So they didn't explicitly start the museum, but I like to say that the AEC Mineral Museum continues to do that with a degree of excellence. Well, almost immediately, the school started buying mineral specimens for teaching purposes. And Arthur Edmund Seaman joined the school in 1890. He eventually became a professor, department chair. But around 1902, he took some of the specimens from the teaching collection and set them aside for display. Actually, he had already developed another display that Patty will talk about. But we say 1902 is the birth of the museum, and thus we've been celebrating since last year the museum's 120th anniversary. The museum was named in his honor in 1932, and fittingly, the mineral Seamanite was named in his honor in 1930, and his son Willis, a geologist and curator, was one of the co-authors of that paper. The archives and even family that we know give testimony that they really loved A.E. Seaman, as did his students and his colleagues. He died in 1937. Well, there have been 8 curators at the museum, and I've got pictures of all of them here, who served as 2 separate terms as curator. And there's A.E. Seaman, his son Willis, Kirill Spiroff, a professor, one of our Spiroff's geology students, Gene Peterman Kemp Zimmer, and then Stan Dial, then George Robinson, then Chris Stefano. I'm in my first term, so I'm photographed there, but I'm not listed. And that's my my office before I became director and curator.
All right, we'll give it another 5 seconds. All right.
Oh, looks like the winner is C, Kirill Spiroff, and that is exactly right. Spiroff was curator at 2 different periods. He was the second curator, and then Willis Seaman became curator for a short period, and then Spiroff once again. Spiroff was named in his honor by a Tech alum, Joe Manverino. The museum is the official mineralogical museum of the state of Michigan, according to a joint Michigan House resolution. And very importantly, we are a cooperating site of the Keweenaw National Historical Park, very valuable collaboration. But for me, one of the most valuable things that's happened since I've been curator was being able to meet Jack Seaman and his wife Phyllis. Jack is A.E. Seaman's grandson. 2 weeks ago, he turned 104 years old, and they are just delights. And here I'm in a picture with them and Bill Roberts, one of our vice presidents, visiting Jack on his 103rd birthday, because he and Phyllis have established an endowment to support curation of the museum. It's one of the most important things to show that the university and the Seaman family are really behind the museum, and that's so important to keep us going. So we're very grateful to Jack and Phyllis Seaman for helping the museum in this way. Looking to the future, we have a variety of programs. The museum's looking to grow, people, places, and things. And I love this symbol of the future. There on Jack's 103rd birthday, he's shaking hands with my granddaughter. So there's the grandson of the original curator shaking hands with the granddaughter of the current curator, and they are 102 years apart. What a great testimony to what museums do. Go from the past to the future. What tremendous value. Well, here's the museum in its current facility. It's just a wonderful place. We have over 8,000 square feet of exhibit area, but rather than show pictures of it, as Will said, we're going to take a little walking tour because we have over 4,000 things to see today. Ready? It slept. Let's try and get our mobile going. We should be good. Yes.
Then can you stop sharing?
Yes.
Oh, we gotta change the camera around. Okay, so when guests first walk in, the first thing they're going to walk into is our gift shop. The museum has not always had a gift shop. That started in the 1990s sometime in the previous location where the museum was housed down on the campus in the Irk building, as I'm sure some folks might remember. But the gift shop has become a huge part of the way the museum operates. It helps us fund the museum and its vision and what we hope to do. And so here I'm just going to show you sort of, because we're doing a lot of talking about copper today. So this is sort of some of the material we have on offer for folks that come in. And one of the things we always get from guests is they're surprised that this isn't already the museum. And so that's always lovely to hear. And so almost immediately when you first walk into the gift shop, you're going to see the sheet copper. I'm just going to let John move out of the way. And this sheet copper is from White Pine Mine. It was from one of the not longest running, but it was the last running mine that closed in the 1990s. It's quite large. People love taking photos in front of it, and it's just a really gorgeous specimen. And so at this point, we're in the Thomas D. Schaffner Hall, which is going to house the whole part of the museum. And there's any number of cases, but we kind of have to pick and choose. And one of the ones I always like to talk with visitors is this case, which is focusing on A.E. Seaman. And we call him A.E., not Arthur Edmund, because that's actually how he preferred to be called, was A.E. And one of my particular favorite parts of this case has to do with this photo here, which is from the Paris International Exhibition in 1900. And you can see there are 4 specimens that are being highlighted in the photo. And we still have those specimens, and they're still currently on display. So I just love that, over 100 years later, 120 years later, we still have these specimens. At one point, they were in Paris, on the other side, on another continent. And I just think that's really something interesting to see. And we're going to pass it on to John, who's going to talk about mineral stories.
Yeah, one of the things we like to emphasize for visitors is that minerals tell all kinds of stories, everything from what minerals are, why they're important scientifically, why they're important economically, where did they come from, how did they get here, how did they form, even how did they get to the museum itself. And as an example of a story, here in our new acquisitions case, one of my favorite items is actually not a mineral, but an artifact. This is a mining artifact, a copper chisel fan. And this is made by miners. This one in particular was given to a Cornish mining captain, Wesley Chester Clark, in the late 1800s. And it was carried on in his family, who were also miners, mine captains. And eventually it was housed in his son's home in this so-called agent's house at Copper Falls. There was a mineral collection on the second floor along with this fan, and that house burned down on Memorial Day 1937. And amazingly, teenage grandson of the original owner, William Clark, rescued this fan from the ashes sometime later. And you can even see some of the burn marks on some of the blades. These things are highly collectible now. So it's also amazing testimony, again, to the massive copper deposits here. And some of the mines, some of the massive copper were literally hundreds of tons, and you can't just blast that to get it out of the mine. So it was very labor intensive. They would use 3-man teams, 2 sledgehammers, and a cape chisel, and they would manually cut those giant masses into pieces, hauling out large chunks, and also creating innumerable amounts of little copper chisel chips. You can actually still find some of these on the mine dumps. And they would load those into barrels and haul them to the surface. But I think the miners must have had great pride in making these. You can see here, this chisel blade or peeling is probably over 20 inches long. And there's little striations on it, each one representing a hit with the sledgehammer. I think the miners are quite proud of these. Yes.
John, I think I know the answer to this, but I want to sort of test my knowledge here. Why can't you just blast it out?
Copper is so malleable, it just bends and laughs at you. You know, even to cut them was very painstaking. So despite the richness of that kind of ore, that was not the most economical of the deposits. It did, in some of the mines, it did create some returns, but that was not the most economical of the deposits. We're going to jump here to probably the most important display in the collection. These are the best of the best specimens from Michigan's copper country, and just a few of the highlights. We are world renowned for specimens of remarkable calcite crystals with native copper inclusions. And the copper is that penny-like color because it's protected from oxidizing by the enclosing calcite. This is called the rocket. I like this twin. The 2 large crystals are actually symmetrically arranged together, not random. Some silver. This is our iconic copper specimen from the Central Mine. We use it on our logo. And in fact, a recent issue of the Mineralogical Record magazine, actually, I've been subscribing to that magazine since I was about 15 years old. The recent issue focuses on Michigan copper, and we have about 120 of our specimens featured. And there's our logo copper centerpiece. Well, while we're here looking into the Michigan Copper Country Gallery, watching over us all is Douglas Houghton. Patty is going to tell us a little bit more about him.
So Douglas Houghton is the namesake of the location where the museum is located in Houghton, Michigan. And he is our namesake because he was the Michigan State's first state geologist ever. He was also integral in the exploration that took place in the Keweenaw Peninsula to find the deposits of copper. And because of this and his expeditions, he wrote a report in 1840 that was given to the Michigan State Legislature that directly influenced the beginning of the copper mining boom up here. Unfortunately, he died fairly young, but in the time that he was here, he did manage to be quite a prolific collector in his own right. And his collection went to the University of Michigan, which we actually curate for them now under the Michigan Mineral Alliance, and that has been in place since 2015. And so here are some of the pieces. And again, a nice little piece of history. You can see his original little labels for this agate. And I'll try to get really close because you can really see the nice banding of this agate piece, which is really great. So below this, at the start of the Copper Country Gallery, there's a video, which we're not going to play for you today, but this goes through the different ways that copper is formed up in this part of the world. And we also have display cases next to it going through it as well. And we'll just kind of walk slowly by it and hopefully entice everyone to come make a visit to spend more time with each of these exhibits. And to give you an idea of what how big of the copper pieces could be, this is a native copper migdol. So this formed in a pocket and was cut in half, and that's solid copper. So another big part of this gallery is the history of mining, which is all these cases that I'm kind of getting in the frame here. Unfortunately, we can't talk about each segment of time as the mining developed in the region. So we're just going to focus on the first mining that was done by Native Americans. Now, they started mining, 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, and they did it for a long time, as evidenced by the tools that were found in the pits that they would mine. They would do shallow mining, they would pick up float copper, but they would also use to extract copper using tools, specifically these stone hammers, which would be attached to some kind of handle, and then they would hammer away at the exposed copper until it broke apart, which takes a tremendous amount of strength. Here are some of the tools that they made with the copper. When you hammer away at copper, it actually eventually makes it brittle. And so one thing they also did was they annealed the copper in fire to give it strength. So now we're going to turn around and look at another important feature of Keweenaw minerals, which is silver.
And silver is not all that miscible with copper, but when they occur together, it's quite marvelous. So there's a case here that features Keweenaw silver. And I thought I'd just show you a few, including my favorite, which is this feather-like specimen from the Quincy mine.
So John, was silver ever mined commercially, or was it just a byproduct of the copper mining?
And actually, it's something I learned new in reading that new issue of Mineralogical Record. There was explicit mining of the silver for selling. They didn't open it as a silver mine per se, but it was explicitly mined and sold as silver. Unfortunately, I don't remember how many ounces were produced overall, but it's certainly an underestimate because the miners also would so-called high grade the specimens. We have another case featuring the copper included calcites. And I thought I would just show my favorite on the shelf there. Like a natural little gemstone. And just a few other things. This whole gallery features quite a lot of all the minerals from the copper country, but the state gemstone is greenstone. And we have a beautiful variety of polished greenstones. Most of these are from Isle Royal. Still very popular to collect on the beaches, of course, is agate. It's not easy to find big ones, but we have a display here of small beach stones and a little challenge. Can you find the 20 hidden agates? Some of my favorite to have tried to collect on some of the poor rock piles are these agates that have some of their bands replaced by native copper. And it's a little hard to see in the display case, so we're going to try and show you one here up close. This is actually my favorite one from the Wolverine mine.
Oh, wow. That is fantastic.
And I think we are unique in their occurrence here. Just a funny story. When I was in graduate school, a friend of mine at Ohio State came up here, visited the museum, and he came back. He said, "John, you have to see the museum." And I looked at a map and I literally told him it can't be worth it. I was wrong. More cases of copper, and you think, well, how interesting can copper be? It's really interesting. We just in this small section here, on the back side and front side, 8 cases devoted to the copper. But one more mineral that's very popular for collectors is datolite. It occurs as crystals, but here in the Keweenaw, it occurs as these nodules with a porcelain-like texture, but a variety of colors due to the copper and iron impurities. There are collectors who just specialize in datolite. And here we also have a few that are considered the world's greatest, very large pieces.
So I'm going to go ahead and answer one of these questions. The museum moved to this building in 2000. Well, it was a couple years, but it reopened in 2011 here.
Yeah, so Patty, but because the question specifically asked about the museum's time on the I forget which floor it was on, 5th floor maybe, anyway, in the EERC.
That's right. For over 30 years.
So I think you said before that the floor was specifically reinforced in the IRC because of the mineral museum, the weight of the mineral museum. Is that true?
Yes, the museum was part of the plans for that building explicitly. And my understanding was the floor was reinforced for that weight. And
I don't know about the weight, but I know that there's no windows on that floor predominantly, so that the museum didn't have any exposure for conservation.
Yeah, there's
purposes.
north-south windows, but not on the east-west. Okay. Yeah, and Gene Kemp, who I showed in the pictures earlier, designed for that exhibit space new cases. And I think they were rather revolutionary for the time. Harvard, for example, had our old style cases, but these new ones, Gene designed. The glass is actually tilted a little bit further out on the top, so the reflections are minimized back to the viewer's face. And amazingly, all the cases, or most of these cases, were removed from the EERC building and reinstalled here, not only on the floor, but also all the ones that line the walls. So they've really been quite magnificent.
Wow.
And to finish, go ahead, Will, sorry.
The current building is on a concrete slab, so no weight issues. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
And that was where the mine shaft that was found during the construction of this was capped off, so that wouldn't be a weight issue either.
We're built on the MABS vein.
Yeah. Yeah, we're built on the MABS vein, but and the reason it was a surprise is because it wasn't a particularly productive mine or vein for that matter, and people forgot about it until it was unearthed when we were building this building. And someone also asked if the museum was supposed to go over to Quincy, and that was heavily considered. So the Quincy mine specifically, which is only a couple miles from here. And there was an effort to do that, but it didn't pan out. And so I've just been walking by some of the other cases that hold more of our copper, which is really one of the reasons we're internationally renowned is because of our crystallized copper. And I'm going to kind of zoom on this little guy because people like to say that he looks like E.T. So one of the very important galleries in the museum is the formation processes. And this is where we're going to talk about how in different environments, in cool water and hot water, that minerals form. And this is going to have to be left to another time because it is our largest gallery. We also have the Lake Superior Iron District. And in this gallery, you're going to see wonderful calcites and learn about the iron mining. Another exhibit we want to highlight is the meteorite exhibits, which is very exciting. But I specifically want to highlight it because you're going to notice this sort of spacescape on the background of it. And that was a very recent addition done by one of our staff members, Janice Fracke, who's very talented and it was painted this for us. And so we're really happy to see that.
Can I interrupt a second?
Yep, go ahead.
When kids come to visit the museum and enjoy the meteorites, I like to let them hold this. So Teddy out there, age 9, if you come visit me, you can hold this meteorite.
So another gallery we have is looking for the sign and getting it in the frame. There it is, the Great Lakes region. And you're going to see some wonderful celestites and sulfurs, but it's also a gallery we're not going to be able to pop into. And then we're going to walk by an area with our gemstones. And I'm going to highlight one of our donors, Don C. Gabriel. And he donated some wonderful things. And in this particular exhibit, it's opals, which we'll see if it'll come into focus. Well, that one you can see sort of the vibrancy of the blue. It's just gorgeous. Another popular exhibit where you'll see people taking pictures in front of are these amethyst cathedrals. Now, they're not the biggest I've seen. Some of the ones I've seen are more than one story, but these are great and they're beautiful. The color is really rich, which is what you look for with amethyst, being that really distinct purple. And this is also still part of the gemstones, but this is also part of an exhibit we group in with the mineral treasures, which I'm going to pass off with John, and he can talk a little bit more on that.
Yeah, our Mineral Treasures Gallery has not only the gemstones, but other things that show the economic importance of minerals, beauty of specimens, but also these things normally aren't just sitting on the surface. They need to be mined, and the mining produces tremendous wealth and capacity for us, for our society. So we have a section here of the museum that helps us walk through mining a little bit, and also thinking a little bit about modern techniques for properly closing a mine. And then we have a wonderful section on minerals and you. Why are minerals important? And a variety of things we use day to day that come from minerals. And even one particular exhibit that shows just in the making of a car, how many different kinds of minerals are needed to produce the different elements and compounds that are required. Well, speaking of treasures, in this highlight case here, we have a few specimens that are currently on loan. They're from the Quincy mine, pretty large copper specimens. And the story has it they were taken out of the mine by a mine captain who personally brought them up the skip and over to the superintendent's office. And this specimen here in particular is just stunning for the quality of the unbelievably well-formed crystals. And I'm highlighting these as treasures. I mentioned they're on loan. We have the opportunity to acquire these. Now we're going to be launching a fundraising campaign soon. So I hope some of our friends may revisit our website and help make the A.E. Seaman Mineral Museum the permanent home for these.
So,
oh, go ahead.
John, that dovetails nicely with one of the questions that has been asked. I know that you have, so in the area that you started in, there is there are big cabinets of specimens. Do you, and this is a temporary exhibit, do you have other temporary exhibits that you rotate through the museum?
Well, right at the front there, we have that case of the new acquisitions that rotates the most frequently. We also have this exhibit by museum friend Jeff Thiel, who has some of his specimens on loan, and they're pretty neat because they're lapidary materials and carvings, things our collection isn't tremendously rich in. So we do have some rotating and on loan materials.
And then throughout the year, John is also working, you'll choose different pieces to take out of current exhibits and put in new specimens that either haven't been shown before or have been shown at an earlier time.
So a question for both of you. I think what you're saying is that I should not assume that if I have been in the museum once, that if I go back, I won't see something new.
That's absolutely true. And we have to try and keep rotating things for little surprises. And that's one of the things I enjoyed, especially when George Robinson was curator. I'd walk into his office and I'd say, you know, that specimen out there, I don't remember that. And he would grin and say, yeah, I just put that out.
Well, and yes, and then the meteorite exhibits we showed you earlier is a new location for that. And as a result of that being moved, we're also working on expanding the fossil exhibits. So yeah, there's always attempts to get new exhibits every year.
Yeah, moving those cases also exposed 3 cases that were formerly covered by cabinets. So there already are quite a few new things out. Well, I think we're going to transition to a Q&A time. Leave plenty of time for people to interact with us. So I think I'm going to have a seat, and we're back live here, right?
Yes. Although the view I'm getting, I think, is of the ceiling.
Oh,
Okay. So Sue, could you transition us back to my laptop for everybody? And maybe you may have to pin your view to, there we go.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. I see many of you have discovered the Q&A feature in Zoom, but if you haven't, it's down on my screen. It's down at the bottom. It may be off to one side or another for you, but please put your questions in the Q&A, and Patty and John and I will scroll through them and answer as many as we can. So John, I want to ask you this one because I think your knowledge of the history of mineralogy may come in handy here. Is a question: wasn't the official resistivity of copper biased by the silver in the UP copper? So was UP copper used as a standard for something at some time in the past?
That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer. It has been my understanding that the little bit of silver that is miscible in UP copper made it of an exceptional conductivity. So it was highly desirable, but I am actually unaware of its use in the official capacity, and that it may have been biased by that silver. That's a great question. I don't know, actually. So actually, Will, I'm most comfortable if you would read questions rather than have us scroll there.
Sure.
That's dialogue, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I'm going to skip down a little bit because I know this is one that you will absolutely want me to ask. Is there any crystallized graphite in this exhibit?
There is. One of them has a single crystal of graphite that's like 1.5 inches across, which is pretty exceptional. But since we're here, I want to just show real quick one that's my favorite. It's in the native element case, and it's back on my phone in case Sue has to make any changes there. But this occurs in Marilani, Tanzania. The gray matrix there are the graphite crystals, and it happens to be a matrix for gemmy green diopside crystals. It's pretty amazing because graphite normally is not all that interesting to collectors. Even diopside mostly is a rock forming mineral. There in Tanzania, they're exceptional for like almost everything, and including these graphite crystals are just wonderful. But this specimen actually led me on a trek to want to study more the minerals of Tanzania, the gemstone tanzanite. And because of that, we discovered 2 new minerals from that occurrence, but that's another story.
So I'll just note for the record that you noted at a couple of places in your presentation, and Sue, I think we need to go back to the laptop again. So you noted at a couple of places in the presentation that former curators for the Seaman Mineral Museum had minerals named after them. I noticed Seamanite was one, and you referenced one other, which I forget at the moment.
Yeah, Spirophite mentioned.
Okay. And I'll also just note that that tradition continues. And if you want to hear more about that, tune in next year for the Seaman Mineral Museum Part 2. Are there any Petoskey stones in the museum?
Yes, we have a section of minerals from the Michigan Basin. And so in that area, there are some very nice Petoskey stones, polished and unpolished.
And then very similar to that, do you have examples of Jacobsville sandstone?
We have a pretty wonderful garden outside that has minerals arranged according to the different main rock classes: metamorphic, igneous, sedimentary. And so out there we have some fairly large samples of Jacobsville sandstone. Do we have any inside?
Yeah, in the copper formation cases.
Ah, great. Yeah, of course.
So this is a question for both of you, because I know that you showed these wonderful specimens, except those specimens have been carefully curated and preserved, I'm assuming. There are certain things that you need to do to them. So there's a question here about someone who has several native pieces of native copper. Should they be cleaned or protected in some manner?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. My tendency is to want to do the minimal amount necessary to give you a specimen that you can appreciate. Most mineral specimens are not necessarily going to be of tremendous scientific value, and the museum tries to preserve what we can, and so minimize cleaning and washing, or certainly chemical treatments, because that could affect the scientific value. But for most collectors, there's some balance between cleaning versus treating versus enhancing, and the copper is a little bit special, because sometimes to reveal the native metal, you may have to dissolve the enclosing rock, and sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's hard, usually involving, if water's not enough, it might involve an acid, and so it takes care and training, so you don't want to do that if you're not trained. And also some of the acids can actually etch into the copper itself, making it look like a shiny new penny, rather than the specimens we have on display, which have a nice oxide coating on them. So in part, it depends on what your hope is, what you want to see, how you want to enjoy it, and what the quality of the specimen is. Specimens that are very high quality and very nice crystals, we really try and minimize the treatments. We may send them off for a professional to clean. One of the specimens that I like to hand to people to appreciate just how wonderful the copper is, how heavy it is, but also to see up close and to feel the crystals, is this big specimen. This one actually has been lacquered. And so my holding it with my hands isn't going to do any damage to it. But actually, if it was not coated, I would not want to handle it with my bare hands, because the oils and acids in my fingers actually over time can cause a tarnish of the crystals. So for other specimens, I might use the famous curator gloves. That's a hard question to answer, because it has a lot of variables on what you want to do with the specimen, what the specimen is like. So I'm sorry, there's no easy answer.
And then most copper that you're going to see sold in a gift shop has been, especially if it's a shiny copper color, it's been cleaned and probably lacquered as well to prevent, corrosion later or growing a patina. So one of the questions there is, someone has heard a claim, Bruce has heard a claim that in several countries of around the globe that compared to those locations, our copper in the Keweenaw is some of the purest on earth. It is definitely incredibly pure. Bisbee copper in Arizona is also really pure. So we're not the only one. Then doesn't China have some really pure mines too?
Well, most of the commercial mines aren't mining metal. They're mining oxides and carbonates and sulfides. Many of those mines do have some metallic copper there as well. And I'm not aware of analyses of what those the pure metallic copper are like there. You know, the Keweenaw, I think, is the only place in the world where metallic copper was commercially mined. And for us, a common impurity is silver, but some of the copper up here also has arsenic in it. And I'm just not aware of other metallic copper deposits, what they're like.
So, John, can you talk a little bit about the museum as a resource for academics? Because they, so you mentioned that this is one of the things that the legislature said we should be doing, and that you feel that the museum is an exemplar of that. Could you talk a little bit about it?
Yes. Our museum, as well as most mineral museums, do try and provide mineral samples for research. And so if researchers write to the curators and explain who they are and what they're working on, they will try and get appropriate samples to them free of charge, actually. We periodically get requests, and I'm very happy it's not a lot, because it's a bit of work to fulfill those requests, but we're delighted to help in that way. And we are also continuing work with our former director, Ted Bornhorst, on curating a Keweenaw research collection. So that would be explicitly available for better understanding the geological history of the Keweenaw. And also with the University of Michigan collection, that's another resource that we now have to make available for research. And different museums, partly because of the time, their geography, and the interests of the curators over the existence of those museums, will have different areas of expertise. So sometimes it might take different museums to be able to fulfill different kinds of requests. So we're all needed.
So, John, this is a little bit of a teaser for part 2 coming up next year. There's a question, there are a couple of questions, one on the Uperlite display, and then there's another question on fluorescent minerals. So could you talk just a little bit about that? Because you didn't even go by that gallery tonight.
Yeah, I didn't want to get sidetracked, because it's our most popular exhibit, our exhibit of fluorescent minerals, and it is really spectacular. And I'm really delighted that this year we were able to construct a brand new display with timers on it, and it features the sodalite syenite beach rocks. We've had some really generous donations of those, and so that was just completed a few weeks ago. So people can come on up and see some really brightly fluorescing sodalite syenite beach rocks. Those originated actually up in Canada, and they were brought down by glaciers. Actually, Patty has personally collected some of those from Canada. We have some of those on display as well. But we're not going to have time to show those. We want to entice people to come on back in person or in our Husky Bites next year. But I see David Flassbuller asked about the physics of fluorescence. We actually have a 3-minute, or if you're really wanting to know more, a 5-minute video in that display. And so as you start the animation, and it explains the phenomenon of fluorescence there for you, the physics behind it, and it shows you a case at a time as the lights go on and off. You can see them illustrated live. So Dave, our speaker for the next Husky Bites, I'm going to invite you to come on up and visit me, and we'll give you a preview and we can talk about it more.
I'd like to go ahead and quickly answer. I'm sorry, go ahead, Will.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, the question about why are there Oreos in the mineral case, and that would have been from the cases towards the end that John was showing about minerals in you. And specifically, Oreos are in the case because they use titanium oxide to color the white interior part of the Oreo.
Titanium oxide is used for a lot of pigmentation. Oh, here's a question I really like. Do you have plans to enlarge the museum? We have space on our area of land here, south of campus by the football field, and we have need. We don't really have good meeting space here. We're working on a program with 2 teachers to develop a curriculum to bring their classes here, and we would really love to have a space for them, not a static classroom, but a space where we can pass around specimens, have them look through microscopes, open up drawers. A famous curator said, you really can't appreciate a mineral without holding one. And if you can hold a meteorite, yeah, that's pretty special. So we would love to have a classroom for kids. We need more exhibit space, and we could really use a photography studio, because one of the ways we make our collection available to others is in print. And it also documents the collection for posterity. So there's a lot of need for more space. And we're invited not only to dream, but we're invited to put some plans together. And so I am hoping to do that before I retire, and maybe we can see an addition put on.
And John's being modest. A huge part of the reason we want to be able to take photos is because John is known for his photography skills, taking very skillful photos of minerals. And so often they'll be published, and some of them were published in this most recent issue.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, photographing minerals is therapeutic. And my wife actually teases that I have more photos of minerals than I do of my children, and that's true.
John, one of your closing cases there was the 2 specimens which are on loan, which you have the opportunity to acquire. There was a question in the Q&A about how much money do you need?
That's a great question. I have some raised, and I'm a little bit tempted to raise a little more before I reveal that. But when we do launch our crowdfunding campaign website, the amount will be revealed. It's many tens of thousands of dollars, but I'd rather not reveal that yet. It's enough that we really would like the help of our friends to get there. So coming soon.
Okay. What is it about this region of basically what makes the copper country in that the copper here is natural or raw, it occurs as copper, whereas in most other places it occurs as an ore?
Yeah. My understanding is one of the key elements is that the basalt rock here, from which the hot solutions of water dissolved the copper and precipitated it as it cooled, there was no sulfur in it, that got released early on. So there was no sulfur for the copper to react with. So that's a huge factor in not forming copper sulfides, which are the basis of most deposits. Anything you can add to that?
Well, and the other, the fact that we have a lot of crystallized copper, which is not, copper doesn't like to form in crystals. If you think of a quartz mineral or calcite, where they have probably shapes that you can think of in your head, copper doesn't like to do that. And so that's very unique. You mentioned earlier that data here is unique to here because we have the nodular, where typically or elsewhere you'll see it in crystal form. The copper in agates, as you mentioned, is unique to this region. And the agates are also, well, maybe agates aren't as unique to this region because agates come from all over the world. So that they have a very particular look from this region. And the greenstone too is very important.
So we talked a little bit about new exhibits, John, and there's a question from Chris that you're going to be putting in a new greenstone exhibit with focus on the inclusions. If so, when will that be up?
There's a local collector who is really fond of greenstones and has expressed an interest in working with me to develop an exhibit to expand the greenstone display. So that is still in the works, and I don't have a timeline for that.
Okay. So go ahead.
I see a question, what percentage of the collection is shown? We have the A.E. Seaman Mineral Museum side of the collection, because we house two collections. We house ours and the University of Michigan collection. There's about 25,000 pieces in the A.E. Seaman and about 15,000 in the U of M collection. And about at any one time, there's about 10% out in that display. So that's where that number that John shared earlier, 4,000, came from.
Are there specimens, and I know we saw a very small portion of them, of the specimens on display or that you have tonight. Are there specimens that you really want, that you're actively looking for, besides the one that you showed there at the very close?
Yeah, there's a mix of adding to the things you're known for or charged with, both preserving and studying. But then all the curators are going to shows also trying to keep tabs on the opportunistic things. And there seems to be some eras of availability of mineral riches from around the world. When I was growing up, the minerals from Mexico were really prevalent. So the curators at the time took care to make sure they had representative samples, or even if they could, the best samples, because they don't last forever. And next thing you know, they're not available, and the prices are, add some zeros to the end. Another era was the fluorite mining from southern Illinois. It seems common for a while, and then all of a sudden, they're highly desirable and hard to obtain. Russia was a case. The current one is China. And it takes a lot of education now to learn what are the important sites, but that's something I would like to learn more about. And I've acquired a few things from China. It's incredibly important, and the specimens are just fantastic. My personal interest, because of the research I mentioned, because it's a graphite deposit, are the minerals of Tanzania. And so we've been acquiring a few things from there, and I'd like to get some more.
Here's a really pragmatic question. Does it cost, so Steve wants to know, does it cost to tour the museum?
Great question.
Yes, it does. We have a few different admission costs based on adults or kids, or if you're a college student. And so an adult is $8 per person. But then we also, children's aged 8 and younger are getting free with paid admission.
And anyone with a Michigan Tech ID?
Yep, so faculty, staff, and students, the admission is waived if you show your ID.
Steve also wants to know what type of security we have there. I can't tell you.
That's part of the security, isn't it, John?
Yeah.
So there's a question here from Dave about a standard classification system for specimens. So, you go to the library, there's the Dewey Decimal System. Is there a classification system for minerals like that?
I think Linnaeus actually tried to establish some kind of a systematic naming for minerals. And I think it's one of the charming things about minerals is that there is no standard, but there is an international commission that it's agreed upon worldwide. I think at any given time, there's 20 international members of this commission. They have to approve the science before a mineral is recognized formally as new. And they also have a separate vote on the name. So there are some guidelines. You can't name a mineral after yourself or your spouse. But beyond that, it's pretty generous. You can name it in honor of people. Often it's famous scientists. You can name it in terms of the chemistry or variations of chemistry or a locality. Those are probably the most common. But sometimes it's after a property, some Greek or Latin name that would be a reference to a property. But it is one of the charming aspects of the science.
John has a mineral that's been named after him,
Jaszczak,
yeah, I was missing a syllable.
impronounceable by humans.
There's only one to your knowledge and you've never seen it.
I've never seen it. It's in Florence, Italy.
So that's not a specimen you have.
I do not have it, and I like to joke that it's so rare it almost doesn't exist.
And ideally, we would have one day, hopefully.
It's a gold bismuth lead sulfide.
I think every curator that's had a mineral named after them, we have a sample of it.
We don't have George Robinsonite
Okay.
either, actually.
But you do have a sample of Marilanite?
Yes, we have a couple of samples of Marilanite. That's one that I was privileged to be part of the team that described. They're pretty small, hair-like whiskers, but I like to say they're beautiful on the inside and the outside. The crystal structure is quite amazing, and close-up photos of the specimens are also beautiful because they're silvery cylinders.
All right. Well, I see we're coming up, well, actually just a little past 7 o'clock now, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Anything you want to close with, John?
Well, I told that silly story at the beginning that when I saw how far away this place was from Columbus, Ohio, I said it could not be worth a visit. And I was wrong. It is absolutely worth a visit. I discover new things even still. I might open a door or a drawer and say, oh, I didn't know we had that. But also there's a lot of vitality here. We've got a tremendous team working together. We're working on programs, the collection's growing. So it's pretty exciting, and I'm very thankful to the university. They're very, very supportive of this place. So we have a bright future.
Well, John, Patty, thank you for joining us for Husky Bites tonight. And I hope the rest of our attendees will join us for our next presentation by Dr. David Flaspohler on birding in the Keweenaw. And with that, we'll sign off for the evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for hosting, Will. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Good night.